Hello everyone. Happy to welcome all you here. And today we have a masterclass by Professor Jan Miles. I'll make a short introduction of him first. Professor Jan Miles graduated in psychology, from the University of Manchester. And he was working for a long time as a researcher at the University of Sussex and working on a range of studies, co-authoring some major reports and books devoted to future studies, service economy, information technology, innovation, and other topics. Then he joined the University of Manchester. This university's program of research in engineering, science, and technology. And he was also a director of this program and a founding director of the Center for Research and Innovation and Competition, also at the University of Manchester. Then in 2011, he became head of the newly established research laboratory for economics of innovation here at the High School of Economics, where he basically spends a lot of time, at least spent before the pandemic. Yes, I hope that it will continue after. Jan also teaches as a master's program, Governance on Science, Technology and Innovation, and supervises master's and PhD dissertations. And he has a wide-ranging research interests, including technological innovation, science and innovation policy, service industries studies, and of course, knowledge-intensive business services, and finally, creative industries and creative economy. And today, Professor Miles will talk about the development of creative economy in the UK and about current challenges that creative industries face, and also about policies that the government implements in order to support this sector. His talk will be split into two parts, and we have a discussion after each of them. So please prepare some interesting, maybe tricky questions for Professor Miles. And having said this, I pass the floor to Jan, please.
Thanks very much. I will share my screen because I like using PowerPoint. They save me having to write notes for myself. The host is disabled participant screen sharing. Can I please have my power to share screen?
Yeah. Yes. Now you have this power.
Okay, here we have. I have the power. Right. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about creative industries, of course. I will have quite a focus on the UK, the United Kingdom, where I'm living, even a bit on Manchester, where I'm living. But hopefully there will be messages that will be relevant beyond that. So all I have to do is get the slides to start moving. Come on. Okay, so I'm going to be making two presentations. The first one will be very much around politics and the policies and the emergence of particular policies for creative industries, taking the UK as the main example. In the second part, after we've had a break, I'll talk about the coronavirus pandemic crisis, what I often call the corona crisis, and the impacts this has had on creative industries. Again, mainly with UK evidence. So the overall messages are that the topic, of course, is very complicated. What we understand by the creative industries is quite complex. There's very different sorts of sectors involved here. There are many different sorts of organization involved here, many interest groups, stakeholders that want to have a say in the area. Many different government agencies are often involved. We have had a tendency over time to bring more and more things into the same ministries, the same government departments, but still action is fragmented. And there are different agendas underway. Creativity is often about disruption, about creating change, and that can be a problem where it comes to policies, because politicians often want to have their message put across, and the creatives are not always putting across the correct, the approved message. But yeah, despite this, even though they may cause problems politically, they're very important and have to be taken into account. And policymakers would often try to find some compromise with those involved in creative activities. So, talking about policies, there are different sorts of policy actors that are involved here. And we can think of it in terms of geographical scale. For example, that's the top set of box here. Intergovernmental organizations, individual countries, regions within countries, and cities. And maybe even areas of cities within Manchester. There's a little bit of competition between different areas about which ones are the home of various sorts of creative activity. Where is the music quarter? Where are the bohemians? Things like this. And well, these are actors typically that do make policies and implement policies. And here we have different rationales involved. There's the more economic rationale versus the more cultural, quality of life sorts of rationale. There are arguments about whether what's important is the place, or whether it's about facilities and infrastructure, or whether it's more about people and skills, whether it's about competition or other sorts of performance. And then, as well as these sorts of straightforward policy actors, there are other types of actors that may try to influence policy in one way or another. They may put lobby parliamentarians, policymakers, to have their interest taken into account. Some organizations have a degree of power of their own. They can organize major firms in the industry, for example. They can organize particular occupational groups and professions. So in a country like Britain, for example, quite often we find these sorts of groups to play an important role in setting out regulations, proposing regulations to government, setting out accreditation systems, what are appropriate qualifications in the area, making a case for infrastructure. In the case, private firms may install some of their own infrastructure, for example. They help differentiate and define jobs, and one of the main concerns they have is about the quality of jobs in creative industries and the availability of these jobs. And then non-governmental organizations who will often be looking at ethical issues like privacy, for example, or issues of morality as it comes into artistic life, trying to exercise some influence, for example, on what sorts of programs can be shown on television to children, and even what sorts of advertisements can be directed at children. Should any advertisements be directed at children on television, for example? So we have actors that make policies and implement policies, and we have actors that make proposed policies and lobby for policies and have their own strategies in all of this. And first I want to talk about cities as a level of analysis, because cities are often the place where a lot happens. National governments may have their agenda, may want the country to have a particular cultural orientation, to be famous for its music or sport or other sort of creative activity. But often things are actually happening at a more local level in cities. So you see a lot of discussion of what are creative cities, what makes for creative cities. And consultancies rank the most creative cities, for example. This is from a survey of people as to Tokyo apparently is the most creative, for example, London is fourth. In a way here we have cities competing here. There are several ways in which cities compete. And one way is they may compete in actual formal competitions that are held by intergovernmental organizations, for example. We'll look at one of those in a moment. But they may also compete in other things, like for investments. So Manchester, for example, made a big effort about 5 years ago to try to attract Disney's filmmaking activities to be based in Manchester, in this country. So some other cities may compete to have Disneyland built near the city, but we were competing for jobs and for creative industry jobs in cinema and related activities to be based here. We didn't get it. I think it went to Barcelona in the end, actually. We did get a lot of the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, our main radio, TV, and a lot of internet activity. Had a whole part of its activities moved up to Manchester in some very swish new buildings that were put up there in a part of town that used to be the old docklands, where the ships used to come and collect things that were being produced by the old industries in Manchester, and is now called Media City. It's a part of town with now a lot of TV production companies, software companies, things of this sort going on in it. So there was a competition there. Other British cities were trying to get that. Manchester got that one. But then there are more formal competitions, and international organizations often run them, and European Union is particularly hot on having an annual competition for the capital of culture. What will be the city in Europe that represents European culture that year? And the motives for this seem to be very much an effort to create some sort of social cohesion, sense of being commonly European, not European in an ethnic sense, but European in a cultural sense. People that dwell in Europe and that can share the rich national cultures that are present across the European continent. So that one of their goals is to increase the European citizens' sense of belonging to a common area. But it's also seen as a way in which cities can have their development enhanced by culture. And this is one of the points that is made by many of the cities that are involved in these competitions, that they see this designation as being really important in helping to allow the city itself to become better known in Europe, recognized as a possible destination, a destination for tourism, a destination for investment and the like. Maybe even they can capitalize on it by, oh, well, our city also has a particular cuisine. Where, you know, in Britain, lots of different cities have their own famous cakes, for example. So we can make a fuss about these are the cakes that come from this city. And this is widely believed to have actually played a very positive role in the regeneration of a couple of cities in the United Kingdom that basically didn't have a very good reputation in the past, where people remembered bad things that had happened to those cities historically. And they were able to re-establish themselves as modern places where you might like to go if you're a professional person, not as somewhere that you don't want to go to because it's got no culture and it's got a lot of gang violence and a lot of empty factories and things like that. So cities often, you know, don't wait for competitions. They undertake their own initiatives off their own bat. If I had longer, I would show you a lot of pictures about how Manchester does this with all sorts of international festivals of arts and music, street festivals, and organizing activities around events. We have just had Halloween, and Halloween in Manchester is quite a big event with all sorts of things on all sorts of buildings and activities going on around the streets at night and things like that. These are activities which not just the creative sector gets involved in, they're activities which, for example, the retail industries will get involved in, because they see it as a way of bringing people into town to do shopping in town. If they can say come and have a shopping visit, and you can also see the monster that's crawling off our roof, then more people will come, or at least that's the idea. And there's a great deal more I could say about this city and indeed about many cities around us. But one thing to say is that the city has found other partners. So it's not just the creative industries, it's not just the entertainment sector like nightclubs or bars or things like that. But also there's a role has been undertaken by the universities in Manchester. So the main University of Manchester, the one I'm at, has launched its own Creative Manchester project, investing a lot of money in building its facilities to be helping to develop arts industries, cultural, creative industries more generally. And one of the things that it played a role in was winning another one of these competitions, becoming a UNESCO city for literature. And one of the other universities play a big role there because that university has a creative writing course, for example. So just to make the point, there can be various stakeholders get involved with initiatives, and often these initiatives are not conducted at a purely national level. They're initiatives that are being undertaken at more local levels, in this case at city levels. And we can think there will be other initiatives that take place even in corners of large cities, and there are initiatives that might take place on a sectoral basis, and even initiatives that will be representing particular parts of the population, like women in arts, for example, like Black people in film, and so on. Particular social groups may want to mobilize around their own policies in this field. Manchester, final point on the Manchester in front here, we had a creative champion. And maybe it's very important to have creative champions. Maybe if you can have a person who has experience, charisma, knowledge of how to get things done, you will get more done. So Manchester is fortunate in that the person that is the city mayor has had experience of being a government minister for the government department that is responsible for creative and cultural industries. And he's on record as talking up these industries, seeing that they are not just marginal activities. They can be at the center of policies of all sorts. Creativity as an element across the board in the economy, not just as something for the creative industries. Oops. So many cities have been active in this sort of area, and many cities have hired consultants to come and tell them what they need to do. And there are a lot of consultancy reports of that nature. Some of them are very useful sources of data. Some of them are very good sources of policy ideas about the sorts of things that cities might need to do by way of making parts of the city attractive to people in various creative industries. Like one very basic thing is to have places where people can go and network, studios which people can work in, but importantly, cafes and bars where people can do their networking and exchange their professional knowledge and opportunities. And often people are making use of the ideas that were put around at the beginning of this century, most prominently by Richard Florida, but many other people jumped into this, about the rise of the creative class as a dynamic class in 21st century economies, the role of cities in fostering the creative class. I have some reservations about the details of his arguments, but many cities have jumped on these arguments as supporting their own efforts, as have some national governments. So before talking about national governments, just to mention, there are, of course, other types of actors, international bodies and creative industries themselves who can act on an international basis or on a national basis. There's the European Video Games Federation, for example. Keep going the wrong way, I'm sorry. across the EU, we've seen a wave of activity with many countries getting involved in establishing policies for creative industries. So there was a big survey carried out and published in the European Competitiveness Report in 2010. I don't know of any more recent survey, but in this survey, people were interviewed in a lot of different countries in the EU, across all of the EU member states. 90% of the member states, they found the term creative industries to be used in policies somewhere or other in the governments of those countries. And when asking, what are the important reasons for government agencies to be active here, a range of reasons were given, but the very important ones tended to be economic ones. The creative industries are innovative, they support innovation, they encourage economic growth, they create new jobs, they give visibility to our national products, things like this. And then there are some other things that are important as well, around attracting creative professionals, people into your area to do the work. Here's the first one that's really a quality of life type issue: securing cultural diversity. Yeah? Many of the other rationales are very instrumental. The creative industries will increase the attraction to tourists, for example. But we see that the cultural diversity and quality of life are also things that feature, although less prominently than the really important, more instrumental activities. And what policies are being practiced? The ones that are most commonly practiced are ones that are relatively cheap policies at a national level, like supporting networking events, conferences, for example, or providing funding for people in a particular sector to get together and meet regularly. Grants for some big projects, typically big projects, not necessarily, in cultural and creative activities. That, of course, has been an activity that's often been the case, that, say, theatre groups or opera performances and things like that have had some level of state subsidy, for example. Providing support for training, providing support for building clusters in these industries, providing marketing and PR support, especially where it comes to international marketing, helping build links to sources of finance, helping support the creation of intellectual property rights. These are things that are all register rather highly in the policy portfolio of different countries. And at city level, studies show that often cities get involved with property, with making facilities, physical facilities available in particular parts of town, often reconditioning old industrial facilities and making them available as galleries or as studios or as workshops of one sort or another for people in creative industries. Providing other business support, grants and loans again, and things like that. Fast broadband has become an absolutely critical issue for many of the creative industries. So a range of policy rationales, a range of different policies that get practiced. And of course, these things vary over time. And the UK provides us with quite a good case of this. We can see, I'm going to give you the very rapid tour of developments in the UK from the end of the Second World War, as it's known here, to more recent years. And through some very big developments, the development of joining what was then called the European Community became the European Union, and we joined that in 1973, and we have left that at the end of this period. But what is perhaps most relevant to us here is that there's been some processes of long-term change, economic change over this period, but there's also been an oscillation in the political parties that are in power between the two main parties, Most of the time, it's one or other has been in power. The Labour Party, which is more left-wing party, Conservative Party, more right-wing party. That's a very simplistic description of them. Both of them have changed a lot over time in reality. But those shifts of government are often very important for seeing shifts in policy direction. We begin after the Second World War. This country had been hit very badly by that war. There was a lot of urban damage. Bombing campaigns have created great holes in many of our cities. There have been huge campaigns against well, almost all of the cities, in fact. And the country wasn't really in a fit state. It hadn't really recovered economically from the war. So it wasn't really in a fit state to launch any major international trade shows or anything of this sort. What was decided upon was the Festival of Britain, which was really going to be done to raise people's morale. The idea was to give them a sense of national pride, national unity, belief that there could be a great national future ahead. So a festival was set up with the idea that it would be a tonic for the nation, covering a whole series of areas, especially architecture, design, visual arts and film, and also to some extent science, with a lot of activities, a lot of new build in London, for new facilities that are still very prominent in London to support this festival. A great many performances, traveling shows that went around the country, generally regarded as pretty successful in doing what it set out to do. It was begun by a Labour government. It was, when it took place, there was more or less a Conservative government in power, but it still continued successfully. Following that, there's a period where there's not much political action that is directly oriented towards creative industries. There's a period of gradual recovery and economic growth, not the most rapid economic growth in Western Europe by a long shot, but still enough growth that the Prime Minister that ruled for quite a while, Harold Macmillan, could talk to the country and say, you've never had it so good. So go on voting for us, you discontents. Things are good for us nowadays. And one of the ways in which things were good was that people's wages were increasing, unemployment was relatively low, the economy was transforming. There were more service sector jobs, more white collar jobs, more jobs requiring skills, and higher education was increased a lot. So the number of people that were students increased. Part of the expansion of higher education was the expansion of art colleges. They've almost all disappeared into universities now, but there used to be a separate institution, which was really important for nurturing several generations of creatives in this country. Governments here get old and cold and tired, and this government got old and cold and tired, and it had scandals. It had scandals to do with spying, to do with a government minister lying to Parliament about his relationship with a woman who had a relationship with a leading member of the Soviet embassy in London. There was a huge anti-establishment movement begun, and a boom in satire, in political humor, directed against the authorities to a very large extent. So a very popular satirical magazine was launched at that time, Private Eye. There were satirical programs started on television that actually saw a big shift in the sort of television comedy that we had. Previously, comedy in mass media had been very comfortable, not asking many questions. We started entering a new era where comedy could be challenging. Of course, not everybody liked that. There's a lot of criticism of that. So we had a shift in government. The Labour Party came into power. The Labour Party was saying, you know, the establishment that has been in power for a long time, that is ruled by upper class people. And we are going to modernize things. We're going to be a meritocracy based upon merit. Many of us will not be from upper class backgrounds, and true for the Prime Minister himself. We will embrace popular culture. Look how in touch we are with the mass of the people. We're so in touch that we can have the Beatles come and party with us. And we will even make sure that the Queen gives the Beatles medals. The Medal of the British Empire, for example. And this was at the time very unusual. Nowadays, in order to make themselves popular, politicians will always be awarding honors to entertainers. This was very unusual at the time. And Wilson's a very interesting character in lots of ways, because he was someone that believed in modernization, believed that a technological revolution was underway, and that this was being mirrored in the growth of new forms of popular culture. And it became a marketing thing for the whole country, really. The idea of swinging Britain, of swinging London was a big thing. There were films and songs in the charts in several countries, and popular British musicians performing all around the world, which it really did make it seem that there was a major shift in culture. Things have been much more opened up, moved away from the traditional comfortable ruling classes towards a much more democratic and maybe more cosmopolitan country. Wilson was one of the politicians to learn that creatives can be unpredictable. They can be making fun of you behind your back. You might give them medals, but then they might return the medals on political grounds and get a lot of publicity from that. And Wilson's own government failed to secure ongoing economic growth. They ran into all sorts of problems. They themselves became regarded as somewhat old-fashioned and staid, time to be replaced by a new government. And there was a wave of succession of Labour government, Conservative government, Labour government, and eventually we got the rise of Thatcherism towards the end of the 1970s, where a new broom swept through politics in the shape of Margaret Thatcher, proclaiming Victorian values, hard work, thrift, watching your pennies, not spending money profligately, rewarding the enterprising and the hardworking, not giving away things like free school milk to children anymore, having public services that were much more run on the lines of private firms, and bringing managers from private firms to oversee as many public services as you could manage, privatizing some public services. So the public telecommunications company became a private organization, British Telecom, for example. Talked a lot about deregulation, but often this actually meant new regulation, because the private firms that were set up where there had been public firms needed some sort of public governance. Otherwise, they would just make lots of money, but nobody would have a telephone anymore. We want to ensure that they continue to provide telephones to people across the country, for example, without just choosing the places where people were richer and would make more telephone calls and things like that. One of the things Thatcher did was take away a lot of things that were supporting some industries. There was a huge crash of British manufacturing industry. In 1 year, 1 million jobs were lost. A lot of people were unemployed. A lot of people that had been miners or factory workers couldn't go and work in the new jobs in the service sector. They didn't have the skills. They didn't look the part. There was a great deal of criticism of Thatcherism from young people in particular. We saw the rise of punk rock. We saw the rise of two-tone music, which was particularly riding anti-racism, because there'd been quite a rise of racism in the UK in this period as well. But the Conservatives maintained their power for a long time. And during that time, there wasn't a great deal being done about creative industries. We'd long had odd policies to support British sport, to support high culture like opera and ballet and things like this. The main driving concerns were about the heritage, really, preserving the national heritage, the great things of the past, and making sure that these could be reproduced into the future. And that meant supporting elite aesthetics, elite tastes, and the like. And when Thatcher left power, she handed over to another Conservative Prime Minister, John Major, and there were quite a lot of things started under his period in time. It wasn't a very long period in time, but one of the things he started was he set up a government department of national heritage. That is, he brought together quite a few different activities into a single ministry, a single part of the government structure in his period of time. So it was still very largely heritage activities, looking after the royal palaces, for example, looking after the royal gardens, looking after historic monuments and archaeological sites and things like that, looking after libraries. But it did also include attention to media, attention to sport, attention to tourism, for example. What marked a big change was the next Labour government, which came into power at the end of the 1990s with Tony Blair. Again, promising modernization, promising a shift away from just conservative activities of conservation and towards more creative activities of new art, new music, new fashion and the like. And this was another period where there had been quite rapid growth under Thatcher and Major, especially of the financial sector, especially in London, where the financial sector was concentrated. And along with the growth of these rather rich people, we saw a growth of the fashion industry, a growth of music, of clubs, things like that. There was a lot of discussion of ideas like Britpop, the new wave of popular music, rock music mainly, that was emerging, of Brit art, the young British artists who were rather iconoclastic school of young men and women of a lot of different ethnic backgrounds who were creating very dynamic, often rather shocking, at least shocking to the establishment, artistic products. Tony Blair represented himself as being well behind that. He'd himself played in a rock band when he was a student. And he had got votes from young people by appealing to rock musicians, by going to one of the annual awards for new music in Britain, for example, the Brit Awards, positioning himself quite clearly in that. And just like Wilson hosted the Beatles, Blair hosted a get-together of new creatives in Britain. This is Noel Gallagher of the band Oasis, which was probably the most working class of all of the Britpop bands. A lot of the Britpop bands are actually rather upper class people themselves. Noel Gallagher from Manchester, in fact, where Oasis came from. There's some good stories of what was going on here at this time. But the effort of politicians to gain popularity through association with creative entertainers was apparent. But it's more than just that. In this case, the Labour government decided to invigorate the Department of National Heritage to create a whole new important government department Department of National Heritage was really a back office, a back quarter. This was a front office. The Department for Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS. Now it has digital added as well to its name. And this was going to be not just the traditional high arts. It was going to take into account a lot of new activities as well, like internet-based activities, like new forms of art, like video games, for example, where Britain had got quite a vibrant industry developing. London is also a sort of center for digital effects for films. Many of the films that you see as Hollywood films, like Star Wars and The Matrix and things like that, and Gravity, have a lot of their post-production digital work carried out in London through a whole variety of studios that operate there. And these developments had been picked up by the Labour Party when it was out of power. It realized that there were new things happening which it could capitalize on. So it did set up the new department. This department set up a creative industries task force, which was charged with the task of saying, well, what are the creative industries? Should we do anything for them, and what can we do for them? So all of this discussion of the statistics, what is a creative industry, what isn't a creative industry, how do we go about counting it, was very much based upon the work of the Creative Industries Task Force, which ran a whole series of studies and produced a whole series of reports on mapping and measuring creative industries, seeing how important and influential they were, what they contributed to the economy, where they were concentrated, and things like that. So these are the sorts of things that were underlying this wave of interest from the British government. The creative industries were rising and many other things were declining in the UK. So this is the sort of thing we have to pay much more attention to. Okay, so there's a whole series of milestones involved here. The task force was set up, it did its mapping and updated its mapping. It set up a program of funding into creative industries, published a major report. This was under a new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, Creative Britain, which was laying out a plan for the future. There was a lot more going on, which I haven't talked about, around media, telecommunications, television, internet medium policies in that area as well. So we used to have an Oftel set up under Thatcher, which was the Office of Regulating Telecommunications. Now we have a very complicated body called Ofcom, which is responsible for all communications industries, basically. And there are many, many things that government is involved in here, like regulating competition policy, regulating privacy policy, regulating universal access in some areas, and regulating also issues to do with what can and cannot be done, you know, like control of pornography, for example, and criminal activity on new media. So what we saw was that we had begun by having very much a heritage focus, and we moved towards much more of a focus on heritage plus novelty. And where we come to novelty, then we will often have disruption. This was pointed out by my colleague Bruce Tether when he was doing work on this topic under a project called Creative EU. So we have education, we have quality of life, we have celebration, we have entertainment, and we have challenging activities. And there are rationales for policy associated with each of these. And we can go into a lot of detail on this, but this is an idea of some ways we could go about thinking about this. We can think about the rationales which are much more to do with preservation and heritage, and rationales that are much more to do with novelty and challenge. And we can think of rationales that are very much external to the creative industries, like it's creating incomes and jobs and soft power, for example, which can happen at national or local level, Or we can think of things that are much more internal to the creative industries, like, whose voices are being represented in the creative industries, who's included, who isn't included, what's the ethical governance of this industry, what's its contribution to various aspects of the quality of life. So we can see there are many, many things that are involved here, many policies, and often we will have a combination of policies, a mix of policies, with a mix of policy rationales operating at the same time, and with different stakeholders active, like collaboration and cooperation from creative industries and creative professionals themselves, with different rationales playing. So to wind up very, very quickly, we had this policy Creative Britain announced in 2008 by Gordon Brown. This is going to be the big policy for creative industries in the future. We're going to have all these great things which are going to create new jobs, train people, stimulate innovation in the area. We're going to set up this creative forum to bring together industry leaders and technology leaders and other stakeholders. And it all crashed because in 2008, we entered the Great Recession. The economies around the world stalled. Many creative industries, income dropped considerably, very rapidly. Not all of them, interestingly, but the great majority of them, it dropped rapidly for a few years. For some, it has recovered. For some, it remained pretty flat after that. And that would take us into the pandemic, which will be the part of the second part of this presentation. So you probably have your own questions to ask or things that you want to discuss yourselves in the light of the points that I've been making. And do be absolutely free to disagree with anything I've said. These were some ideas I thought might be things people might like to talk about, but you may well have your own issues and agendas that are far more important. So I'll say over to you, Mikhail. I guess you will moderate this bit of discussion in some way.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for this really great overview of the UK modern history through the lens of the creative industries. So I would like to ask the audience, the students, so who would like to ask some questions? Did you think of them while Professor Miles was talking or not? Please, Paulina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miles, for your presentation. I was wondering, Tudor is very vulnerable to crisis. And could you name some measures to decrease that vulnerability that are taken, or maybe some insights on where to research that topic?
Okay. Should we take a couple more questions and then I'll try and answer them all in one go? Otherwise, I will just talk and talk and talk and there won't be enough questions.
Okay. Yeah. So I see another person who would like to ask you. Alexander, please.
Yeah, my question is related to Brexit. I'm wondering, now it's more difficult, I guess, for Europeans to enter the UK and work there, and what implications that might have for the creative industry in the UK, because I guess creativity is also a very international and culturally diverse thing. And on the other hand, then Britain is kind of closing itself off. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else? Or other people are thinking still? So maybe I will add one more question on my side.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, Jana, I noticed this slide with EU study of the ministries, yes, across different ministries, and one of the major motives for interventions in the creative industry, as far as I got it, were like support of innovation and encouraging of economic growth. Yeah. So probably you could say a few words about some relevant types of innovations for creative industries. Taking into consideration that you made studies like a number of years ago, yes, devoted to innovation in creative industry. I think this could be interesting to people. And also, I see one more question in the chat, also by Paulina. What determines the impact of a particular group of actors, maybe in relation to creative industry specifically? So, as far as I understand, Paulina is talking about this group of actors which you mentioned in the beginning of your talk. So,
yeah,
the floor is yours now.
All right, I'll try and handle those more or less one by one. So Paulina's first question about policies to deal with the crisis. Okay, that's a really good question. I will be talking in the next part of the presentation about policies in reaction to the corona crisis, to the pandemic, which actually I would say that the pandemic impact on the creative sector has been a lot more severe than the Great Recession. The Great Recession it operated largely by hitting disposable income, so that people, consumers, didn't have so much money to spend on creative activities, and on reducing the amount of finance that was running around looking for things to invest in. And probably the main reason for the Great Recession was really that there was a surplus of capital that was getting invested into all sorts of unsustainable activities. And then when people tried to get some of that money back, it all collapsed. Some of those unsustainable activities were almost certainly artistic activities. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the theatre, play and film and now musical, The Producers, where the whole plot is driven by the fact that people are aiming to get money out of rich investors by getting them to invest in a theatre production that they know will never make any money. It will collapse. So they can get lots of people to invest in it, more people than were really needed to invest in it, make a lot of money, but tell everyone that they lost their money because the show collapsed. I guess you know this comedy, Mel Brooks. In the story, the problem is that they have a success, you know, they created what they thought was the worst stage show ever, and it turns out to be massively successful. So they don't have a problem of how to account for the fact they don't have the money to give the people. Similar sort of thing, it probably happens in a lot of other areas in the cultural industry when there's a lot of money around. When there's a lot of government money around for investing in the arts, then quite often there are projects started which never really culminate. You know, a new film is going to be made. Films are very expensive things to make. Not all of these new films ever work out quite so well as people had hoped. Anyway, that was a long way of saying there are two problems. One is that people didn't have money to spend on going so much to music shows, to film shows, to clubs. One problem is that people didn't have so much to invest in big new creative activities, like new shows of one sort or another, new parks, new festival events, and so on. This was relatively short-lived, though very painful for a lot of people. A lot of people have their fingers burned. They were launching something with great expectations, and then it collapsed, and a lot of work was wasted. Maybe they have some things that they could salvage, but a lot of things they couldn't. So you get some people who need support in the short term to buy them over, to help them get over these things. And our system is not really very well set up to deal with people in the creative industries. And I'll talk more about this later, but one of the big problems in creative industries is that there are a lot of people who are only part-time employed in these industries. It's estimated that in this country, only there's something like less than 8% of the theatre roles available for all of the actors that there are in the country. So an actor can be, the average actor would be unemployed except for one day every 2 weeks. Now, of course, not everyone is the average actor. Some actors are employed all the time, very few. Some are employed to, and that's quite a lot, to a moderate level, and a lot are hardly employed at all. And typically, they will have to find something else to do, because although we have systems of benefits for unemployment here, they're relatively harsh systems. They don't really support people very well in the long term. So there were many people who are aspiring actors, singers, painters, things like that, who can only do their creative activity as a part-time activity. And the rest of the time, they will be driving taxis, working in restaurants or bars. Bars are very common these days. Decorating people's houses, you name it, all sorts of activities. In the pandemic, to jump ahead to the next presentation, it was recognized that many organizations like theaters, like opera, like music venues, were not allowed to operate because the government set rules saying they cannot operate. So the government felt some responsibility for the people that were in this situation, which it didn't really feel in the Great Recession. So in this case, in this country, what was introduced was a scheme called furlough, which meant that the employers, like you're a theatre and things like that, the government would pay you some of the wages that people would be getting if they were allowed to work. And this money was to be paid to the workers. Usually it went to the workers. It didn't give them as much as they would have had, but it would usually give them enough to live on. So that's one possible reaction to that sort of crisis. But that's a crisis where government feels a moral obligation to offset the results of its own policies. There can be other sorts of things as well. So you can support the workforce, you could support the organizations, you could try to build demand. For example, this doesn't work very well in a pandemic, but in a recession, you can buy tickets to shows, and you can say, all of the school children can go to this performance, for example, or all of the elderly people that are on pensions and can't normally afford to go can go to this performance, and things of this sort. And actually, there are quite a lot of schemes of this nature in operation in this country, usually not run by government, usually run by charities of one sort or another, to provide access to people, to creative activities they might be barred from before. Okay, that was a very long answer to a short question, I'm sorry. So I'll try and give shorter answers right now. Brexit is right now causing huge problems, not just to people coming to this country, but for British artists and performers going to other countries as well. There are negotiations going on with the EU countries to try to resolve this problem, which, and I think there is an agreement now on what has been a major problem, like if you were a musician, say you were a rock group and you wanted to do a European tour, then you had to get visas for every country you were visiting. You'd have to get a separate visa. You'd have to have all of your instruments checked and cleared by customs in the different countries. So it was a nightmare. This was really hitting, especially, the less, the more niche performers. If you're the Rolling Stones, you can do anything and go anywhere. But if you're some minor band that has a following in clubs in Amsterdam and Berlin and and Ibiza, then this could be very, very difficult for you. And yes, it works bad the other way as well. Certainly universities, which I'm familiar with, have had trouble attracting talent from Europe. Many fewer students are coming to study here from European countries, and people applying for jobs that come from the EU now have to jump through hoops, which before then they didn't have to. Before then, everyone had to jump through hoops. Before then, only non-EU people had to jump through hoops. Now, everyone has to jump through hoops. The government claims that it's producing a scheme to allow highly talented people to enter the country and work here. So far, what I see of the scheme is very much oriented towards people with two things. One is highly technical skills, and the other is high incomes expected. And we're already seeing this is causing massive problems in terms of getting, for example, nurses. We have shortage of nurses in the country because mobility of nurses from the EU has been reduced. So yes, we have a big problem there, and I'm sure that problem is felt in the creative industries. I mentioned opera before, and I heard a conversation with an opera singer talking about typically how people make progress in the opera world when they're the really prominent performers, and they make progress by performing for periods of time in opera houses in different countries, learning the skills, the methods that are applied in different locations, learning to work with different orchestras in different genres and things like that. And this opera singer was saying, the British music is going to be killed if we don't rapidly change this problem we have right now. Brexit is a huge problem in just about everywhere. It's a problem for fish, it's a problem for pigs, and it's a problem for creatives. We knew it would be a problem. We said it would be a problem, and this was called Project Fear. Yes, okay. Mikhail was asking about innovation. And some creative industries, of course, are very traditional. I know people that do marionettes using very traditional tools developed in different cultures around the world to create puppet shows for a variety of purposes, some of them very educational ones, for example. So some creative industries are certainly highly traditional and glory in their tradition, although often actually behind the scenes, what the audience doesn't see has a lot of novelty and new ways of doing things going into it. But there are also creative industries that are pushing forward technology frontiers. And I mentioned the film special effects before. These people are using highly sophisticated computer systems with highly advanced network facilities, incredible software and things like that, and developing tools and methods of familiarity with these things, learning about them, which can help improve them to become things that can be diffused and used on a much larger scale into the future. And I've been watching this happen over the years with things that are now every day that you can do with your phone were being introduced as art house events 30, 40 years ago. Look at this amazing thing that I can do with this video, with this advanced and incredibly expensive software. Now we can all do it. And we can see a lot of the pioneering work in some areas of activity is done through creative industries as well. So a lot of headway in 3D printing, which is certainly one of the tools of the industry of the future, is being done by people making 3D sculptures or other 3D artifacts, like toys sometimes, or models as creative industry activities. Exploration of virtual reality, the metaverse, as we are supposed to call it now, is very much a product of creative industries, and so on. And then creative industries also, I think, play an important role in providing not just demonstrators of innovations, but also commentary on and critique of some of the lines of innovation. So warnings about bad things that might happen by use of, say, artificial intelligence or virtual realities or social media are pretty widespread. We've had some really interesting television series. I don't know if any of these have been accessible your way, but there was a really nice series on British TV called Kiss Me First, which was about some of the dangers of getting hooked into three-dimensional virtual reality gaming with social media, plus the development of fascistic type cults within the system. And there was a very nice Manchester set serial called Year After Year, where some of the issues of transhumanism came into play. One of the characters is very keen on augmenting her body with new technology, so that she can use her hand as a smartphone, so that her eyes can be communicating with the internet and things of this sort. And again, this explores some of the problems that may occur, maybe problems just direct to do with the technology, maybe or the application of the technology, maybe problems to do with the marketing of the technology and the development. In the case of that serial, they extrapolate. We have now offshore beauty parlors. Yeah, you can go and get cosmetic enhancements done. Some countries specialize in that. You want to change your look, go to Colombia. There are whole cities in Colombia where there's whole streets of cosmetic surgery shops. But be very careful, actually. I'm not encouraging that. Anyway, in this particular serial, there were boats offshore. You could go to Liverpool, get on a ferry, get on a boat, and you could have the surgery to implant the transhuman technology into you. Unfortunately, not all of the people doing this job are the most skilled or ethical practitioners of this activity. It really made me think. I'm used to discussion of human augmentation. I'm not used to discussion of black market human augmentation. So again, creative industries play a big role in innovation and in helping us think about innovation, I think.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think this are very detailed answers to our short kind of questions. Yeah, and what I also was thinking about is that basically creative industries are both producers and consumers of technological innovation, and this is very interesting. I think probably these interconnections in terms of like value-added chains, for example, should be studied more thoroughly. It's still like not studied enough to my mind. I just wanted to say that we are like running a bit out of time, and I would like probably to make a short pause here. Yes, and come back in 10 or 15 minutes. Yes, we are not saying goodbye to you because we have another interesting part of your talk waiting, all of us. So let's make a break for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, thanks. See
10
you
minutes.
in
Thank you.
15 minutes.
Okay, I'm just going to send my chat message off. Okay. Right.
Okay, so let's move on to the second part of this exciting talk about creative industries policies, and now adding the pandemic factor here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just about all the things that I do research on have the pandemic coming up as a big issue. Oops. Now, why has that happened? Okay, so just before the pandemic, we were moving into a shift in government thinking. The Great Recession had led to a long period of austerity, where the conservative governments were trying to restrict public expenditure, to cut services of all sorts, by reducing the money that was being spent on them, reducing employment of people working for the government in one way or another. And creative industries were not being specifically targeted, except for things like museums and the like, where they found their funding was restricted and they were being pushed to look for private sector funding. There was a complaint from people in those more cultural industries that the government was forever telling them, look at America, look at the great museums there, they're supported by private benefactors. And in this country, we were finding that, the billionaires were not so many on the ground, and they were not so keen on giving their money to artistic projects of one sort or another. But when Boris Johnson's government came to power, and they were saying that Britain after Brexit was going to go into a new and dynamic period, we would become global Britain, would be a highly creative country, and they developed what they called the Creative Industry Sector Deal as part of a big fund to support the strategic industries of the future. So overall, the fund was very large. There were billions of pounds being put into this. Actually, the creative industries got a relatively small share of this, but still it was very welcome for people in the creative industry. And there were a number of different programs of work involved. So research projects, cluster projects, and this very interesting thing called the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center, the PEC, which has 5 years funding to be a center of work, or it's a network really, of researchers working on various topics connected with the creative industries. Unfortunately, this was established before the pandemic happened. Its funding was secured for 5 years, and it was set up, and it's continuing to operate and produce good work during the course of the pandemic. So it's doing a lot of statistical and qualitative work on various creative industries, how they function in the UK, and especially how they function around the UK, how in different parts of the country there are different strengths of different creative industry sectors. One of the lines of work has come up with the notion of micro clusters that can happen in particular areas. So not necessarily a strong creative cluster, but nevertheless a micro cluster of some particular part of the creative industries that, for maybe historic reasons, has a great strength in that particular area. So, for example, there are towns in Britain which are very strong in jewellery. Birmingham which is one of the larger cities, has got a very strong jewelry quarter, and as well as trading in jewels and making fine art jewelry, they've been able to capitalize on this by having colleges that are specializing in teaching relevant skills and attract international students. A lot of Chinese students would come to Birmingham to learn this particular craft, which is remarkable given the quality of Chinese owned jewelry. And in terms of something you might want to argue for in Russia, a center for continually doing research on creative industries, it might be a good idea. This particular center is not so much a center based in one building as a network of researchers across different universities, in particular, not just universities, though, around the country, working in a coordinated fashion on different projects of research, which are obviously reviewed and refreshed on a regular
Sorry,
basis.
Jan, for interruption, but basically I would like just to note that we have a couple of such centers and several of them are based here at HSE.
Yes,
hope
that's
so.
good. Yes, good. You can have more. I mean, one of the things that the Policy and Evidence Center will do is to discuss policy issues too, because it has committees of stakeholders brought together. It's got a panel of 20 or 30 leading creative professionals, for example, that it uses as a really good way of getting into the sectors in question and finding who are the key people, what are the issues confronting them and things like this. And one of the things that it's done is to talk about recovery from the pandemic. And it's come up with a briefing report beyond bailouts, that is beyond just giving us money to allow us to survive, ways in which government expenditure could be supported in creative industries. So setting up a center of work, they cost it, doing work on artificial intelligence as applied to creative industries. Setting up an investment program that's not just centered in London to support rebuilding creative industries that have been damaged in the pandemic. Changing tax incentives so that the sort of innovative work that's underway in creative industries can also get tax relief in the way that currently only a very technically defined research and development gets tax relief. So these are three ideas that are promoted through the Policy and Evidence Center. And I'll cite some of their work as we go on further. But to talk about the pandemic, the corona crisis, as I call it, because it's the pandemic, the policies that government introduces to deal with the pandemic, the responses of markets and the public to these policies are all conflated together as part of a big crisis. And the crisis, the issues of transmission of the disease, clearly cause big problems for creative industries, or at least some creative industries, because we like organizing things into threes, especially if the three begins with the same letter. Crowds close together in confined spaces is the best way to transmit COVID, to create a super spreader incidence. So all sorts of places where people would come together, like this is the National Gallery in London, where you can see great portrait pictures, were closed. Closed for months on end. And the result was, of course, a huge drop in the income that they were receiving, in their direct income from people buying tickets to go to places, from indirect income like funding they might get from the city or from local government, based upon the footfall, based upon school visits, for example, revenues that they would get from sales of books, postcards, other things in the shops associated with these venues, and so on. And the result immediately was that a big financial drop was experienced. Immediately, we could see that job advertisements went down dramatically in creative sectors. It was the sector that was the most hit during the crisis. So we heard a lot about how restaurants and bars were being hit, but also creative industries were being hit very, very badly. And policies were developed to deal with the effects of the pandemic across the economy. And there were two major sorts of policies introduced. One I talked about a little while ago, the furlough. And the furlough scheme would give firms and public organizations 80% of the wages to people that were on their payroll. So you couldn't suddenly say, oh, well, I need 20 workers. Will you pay me 80% of their wages? No, you had to say, I have 20 workers who are employed. I want to keep them employed into the future, but right now we have no income for them to pay them with. And in those circumstances, if you could prove you had those people employed and they've been employed for more than 3 months, you could apply to have 80% of their income paid by the government. And that was happening, over 8 million people were covered by that. It was that was an absolutely dramatic policy. We've never had anything like that done in this country before. So a lot of government expenditure on that. There was also a scheme for employment of self-employed people, for paying self-employed people. If you were a self-employed person, and we have a lot of self-employed people, you could apply for funding to cover the income that you're losing. This becomes a lot more difficult because you had to prove that you were making a regular income as a self-employed person. And often that isn't the case for self-employed people. Your income fluctuates in a volatile way from year to year. And that's made life very difficult. But still around 1 million people were getting some compensation for loss of their earnings. And then government provided support to some sectors that were very badly hit. For example, airlines, hotels, restaurants, sports venues, and things like that. And there was some specific support to the creative industries. They made a very big show of providing investment. And it was, in this case, much, much larger than the investment under the creative industry scheme, around 1,000 times larger investment to protect the creative industries. We're here for culture, they said. That was the picture they had when they announced that scheme. A very large sum of money for government. And then after that, another chunk of money, £500 million, to support film and television, because these were seen, not just as being economically very useful industries, although they are. There's, they make a lot of export earnings for the UK, but also as industries where, people need them in this pandemic crisis. People are having to stay at home and not go out. They need to be able to see exciting new shows. And many shows were having huge problems in operating because the pandemic was making it impossible to film things in the conventional way, for example. And then when you did start filming things, people get ill and have to quarantine themselves, and the production was disrupted. The industry was complaining a lot that they couldn't get insurance any longer for their productions. And so they would start things and then have to stop them, and they would lose a huge amount of money and not be able to get insurance for this. So the scheme was set up to help provide insurance specifically so that people could go ahead with their productions. We heard in the Creative Industries Conference last week from one filmmaker who was saying the system was not working for them. It wasn't, they couldn't get funding to cover their costs and that. But still, a lot of people did, and there was a lot of positive feeling about this. But there was also quite a lot of criticism of these schemes. They were seen as being better late than never, but still not as good as they could be. And there was a great deal of criticism from particular quarters in the creative industries that, well, maybe, they're funding the famous national theaters, the famous national galleries and museums and the like, but many smaller venues are not getting funded. Many less familiar places are not getting funded. They're funding the establishment and not funding many other industries. The amount of money, in any case, governments were not supporting creative industries in the past, and now we're on our knees and having losing our income, and there's nothing like enough support for it. So this is from a magazine, Art Review, which was saying, government has made a big fuss about its generosity here, but it's failing to support the arts adequately. There's a lot of gloom in cultural industry sectors. The money involved is nothing like enough to support most of our activities. Whoops. Okay, let's go down. More pervasive, perhaps, is the problem that they're really funding institutions. So they were funding firms and public organizations in the creative industries to keep their workforce online, and then providing them with some extra support to keep their buildings going, to continue to operate their facilities, even though they couldn't have audiences in their facilities. But museums still need to be looked after, for example. Theaters still need to be looked after. And they were paying, with the furlough scheme, they were paying for the employees, but this didn't cover a large number of people in the creative industries. Many are freelancers who work from job to job. They're unable to get short-term employment that they would normally get in theaters. They're unable to exhibit their works in galleries. So they're not employees of these organizations, or at least not regular employees in these organizations, and they weren't covered by the scheme. Some of them could get conventional unemployment benefit, but the amount of money you get in this way isn't very large, and it was proving very difficult for many people to live with. And people were being sacked as well. People were losing their jobs. This was a demonstration from people outside the Tate Gallery, one of the major galleries for modern arts in London. And they were the people that worked in the restaurants, the bars, the shops associated with the Tate Gallery, and they were losing their jobs. And they were staged a protest. We're part of the culture sector too. So the government was supposedly supporting the creative industries, but many people who were workers in the creative industries were feeling that they had been neglected in this support. And something that created a stir, an event, was a bit of a messaging from the government that really undermined their model of supporting the creative industries. There was an advertising campaign telling people, well, you've lost your jobs in this corona crisis, but look to see what new jobs you could have. There will be new jobs in the future. There will be expanding sectors. Look into them. And one of the advertisements showed a ballet dancer and saying, well, sorry, how can I correct this? I don't know, escape. Yeah. Saying, yeah, well, maybe you should be looking wider than ballet dancing. Maybe you should think of job in cybersecurity. Are 3 words: rethink, reskill, reboot your jobs. People in creative industries blew up when they saw this advertisement. This is just typical of what the government thinks of us in reality, isn't it? And the head of the Department of Media, Culture and Sports, Oliver Dowden, said, oh no, this is wrong. You're going mad on social media about this, but this isn't coming from us. It's a crass advertisement. It's from another campaign. We want people in all walks of life to think about their careers. It's not aimed at people working in the arts. I want to save jobs in the arts. Still, the feeling that government is not supporting the creative industries adequately or being too selective in what it's supporting is one that is still ongoing. And just a week ago, we had stories running about governments limiting student numbers in arts degrees, the numbers studying creative arts, because these degrees didn't lead to such highly paid jobs as degrees in engineering, cybersecurity, or whatever. So the sense that government is undervaluing creative arts remains a pervasive one among people in the industry. Just an example of a couple of the responses. There were many people creatively replayed that advertisement, typically featuring members of the government and suggesting what jobs that would be suitable for them in the future. This is one of the less rude advertisements, thing that cyber could work in ballet in the future. Maybe this isn't as stupid as it sounds. Teaching robots to dance. Well, people doing robotics are working on exactly that thing right now. But perhaps a more pointed advertisement was this one over here, where Sean Coleman, a designer, pointed out that actually this whole advertisement demonstrated the importance of creative industries because it's an image taken by a photographer, a typeface created by a typographer, a message written by a copywriter, a layout from a graphic designer, a building designed by an architect, a bench designed by a furniture maker, and so on. All of these different elements from the creative industries. The whole thing is a message, an advertisement created by a creative industry sector. So actually, the advertisement might undermine its own message in this way. So we mentioned that a lot of workers are freelance workers in the creative industry. In fact, it's about half of the workforce in the creative industries are freelancers. And one of the studies done in the Policy and Evidence Center is the Creative Radar. And they had produced a Creative Radar report in the previous year, but in 2021, it really went to look at the impact of the pandemic on the creative industries. And I'm just going to pull out one element of this right now. They looked at lots of different elements of this. But the element in question is the employment of freelancers. And what we see is that overall, there was a strong decline. More than half of the firms in the creative industry decreased their employment of freelancers. They may be managing to retain their full-time regular employees using the furlough scheme. To some extent, there was a decline even there, but most were decreasing the use of freelancers. Some were maintaining their use of freelancers, and very few were increasing their freelance employment. Some sectors like film and TV, advertising and marketing, music and performing arts, the decrease in freelancers was particularly strong. So some sorts of freelancers were suffering a great deal. The jobs for them were drying up, basically, in the crisis. Now, an interesting question is whether you have such a big freelance sector operating in Russia. And if you do have a big freelance sector, is it actually being captured statistically? We do have employment statistics on freelancers because we have a regular labor force survey and people are asked about their jobs. And this will include self-employed people and freelance workers, as well as people in long-term secure employment. creative industries are particularly high in freelancers. Around 15% of people across the whole workforce are freelancers, but almost half of people in creative industries. And almost 3/4 of people in some creative industries like theatre are freelancers. We also have a lot of people that are self-employed. Around 3 million people in Britain are self-employed. We noticed that only 1 million of those were getting the funds from the self-employment relief scheme in Britain. And self-employed workers will include, again, some people in creative industries like craft workers, for example, people running small businesses in marketing, for example, or even music production. For example, I know people that write music for video games exist as a small firm, small business doing this. Most of these people are not therefore able to get funds from the government schemes that were supporting the workforce through furlough. And during the crisis, we see some freelancers giving up on the freelance work and starting to be trained to be something else. Nurses proved to be quite a popular thing to be trained for, because nurses were regarded as heroes in the pandemic. But meanwhile, actually, the number of freelancers was increasing because many people losing their regular jobs tried to set up as freelancers. We have one study showing that the impact was really negative on people who were freelancers. All sorts of problems for them in funding and employment during the crisis. And there's a lobbying organization, excludeuk.org, brings together people that actually produced a lot of interesting reportage to support its lobbying efforts. That basically this is pushing for people who are in this way excluded from these government schemes to be included in one way or another. These people, particularly, it says these people pay taxes, therefore they ought to be able to see the benefits from paying these taxes. And it talks about the people that are involved here: beauticians, hairdressers, plumbers, electricians, creative professionals, and so on. People serving communities with entrepreneurial spirit, taking a risk, and they're contributing to the UK economy. And the Creative Industries Federation went on to say that when it looked at freelancers, it had a wide range of different creative industries involved: writers, producers, artists, including people working in crafts, consultants of one sort or another, people that provide consultancy services to educators, to festival organizers, to all sorts of activities of this sort. There's a great deal of subcontracting of work to different people, often to freelancers, when you're engaged in some creative project. If you have a festival, for example, then there's a whole range of different services you need to have to ensure the success of that festival. And the same is true for many other creative projects, a big film, a big stage production, and the like. So some of our creative freelancers went off to find other jobs. And we get newspaper stories on this sort of thing: DJ turned shaman and lighting, a dancer turned roboticist, a really dancer turned roboticist, just as they were advertising, and a guy that worked in horror films who took a job as an undertaker. Unfortunately, that's a job where there's a great deal of demand during the pandemic. And I'm talking as if the pandemic is finished. It hasn't finished, in fact. We're hoping that we've reached the peak of the third wave. It looks as though in this country, we are just starting to see a decline in the number of cases that is actually been at a record high in the past week. The number of people getting ill with coronavirus, the number of people going into hospital is down considerably on what it was in the second wave. This time last year, we simply had a lot of people catching it, but a lot of people going to hospital, and we were heading towards a big crisis at Christmas. So the situation of freelancers is an interesting one. I mean, a lot of people are freelancers because they're following their dreams. A lot of people are freelancers because they can't get other work. Other employment opportunities are lacking. And there are some people that are freelancers because they have family issues, health issues, which make this a sensible occupation for them to be pursuing, and so on. Employers benefit from freelancers. They can hire people for short periods of time without taking on all the responsibilities for them that they would have if they employed them for a long time. And that's, I mentioned festivals before. Festivals, things happen in particular periods of time. You don't necessarily employ people year-round to help you with your festival that's only going to take place in the summer. In Britain, in pre-COVID years, we had well over 100 large festivals happening every year. And this is not the festivals organized by cities themselves. So it's not the Manchester International Festival. It's things like the famous Glastonbury Music Festival and many other festivals of music, especially music and dance, but also poetry and all sorts of other creative activities. This creates all sorts of problems for statistics. We have this workforce that's sort of shifting in what projects they're working on, where they're working, and things like that. And this is happening at a time where there have been changes in employment. In any case, changes so strong that some people talk about a new social class, the precariat, people who are lacking in job security, in income security, in career ladders, and things like that. So some of these jobs are jobs which are particularly taken by people that are socially excluded in one way or another, disabled people, people displaced from their long-term jobs, some immigrant populations, for example, especially low-skilled immigrants. A lot of them working in so-called gig jobs, like taxi services, like delivery services and things like that. These delivery services have really expanded in the pandemic because people were at home, having to stay at home, couldn't go out to the restaurant, could order a meal from the restaurant using Deliveroo or one of the other delivery services, for example. So a lot of jobs that are relatively low-skilled jobs. If you can ride a bike or drive a car, there are these sorts of services. But there are also creative activities. And what the Creative Industries Federation claims is that these sorts of relatively less skilled gig workers are doing huge numbers of jobs, maybe do 1,000 specific deliveries in a year, maybe a lot more. Whereas the creative freelancers will typically be doing many fewer jobs, maybe 15 jobs a year, for example. And this is a whole field which is a minefield, really, in defining who has the responsibilities for the work, who has the responsibilities for the worker, who should be paying taxes, who should be, we have a system called national insurance. If you are employing somebody as a regular employee, you should be paying a sum of money that is earmarked for health and social services, for example. On that basis, but the firms employing freelancers may not be having to pay that for the freelance workers. So freelance workers aren't benefiting from some of these features of regular employment. They don't necessarily then have pensions developing for them, for example. And this has been a big phenomenon of recent years. Many employers downsize their workforce and then employ the people again as if they were freelancers. For example, many publishers sacked a lot of their editorial staff, closed the big publishing house offices that they had, but employed the same people to do the work as freelancers. They were then paid on a less regular basis, paid by the job, on the basis of the work they were doing, rather than being paid by the hour or by the week in the existing job. Lacked many of the benefits that they would have had were they doing the job. The employer was saving money on offices, now it's saving money on all of these benefits of the job as well. And that's a problem that we find affecting many people in creative industries, not just publishing. Example. These are some of the people that we have trouble capturing. We can capture them in some of our statistics, but there are problems. And one problem is that many people who want to be active as creatives can't get enough money that way. So are getting more money from some, quote, real job by working more full-time in some other industry. As I said, restaurants and bars and the like. And this is maybe particularly a problem for people that are socially excluded, as we said before. And this is the final set of points that I want to make about the creative industries, because this is something which the pandemic may well exacerbate. There are problems of social exclusion in many creative industries. Some are harder for women to access, and they're male dominated. Publishing is a rare exception here. Publishing has a large female workforce, although it may be that the more senior jobs are more male dominated. Most creative industries tend to be very ethnically underrepresented. They tend to be more occupied by the native white British than by ethnic minorities. Information technology, computer software and related sectors are an exception here. But otherwise, women tend to be underrepresented, ethnic minorities tend to be underrepresented. There are huge disparities across different cities and across different regions of the country. And class remains a big issue in creative industries in the UK. Social mobility is something which has decreased over recent decades. And whereas we saw signs that a social class might be becoming less important as a factor determining access to all sorts of opportunities in this country, and this appeared to be the case back in the 1960s, when a lot of sort of working class influence was felt in culture of all sorts. That appears to have dried up right now. So not only is our government extremely unrepresentative of the country in terms of social background, so are many creative industries. One report fairly recently looked at, I'm going the wrong way. Looked at people working in creative industry jobs and compared to jobs in general. And the finding was that whereas in the population at large, in jobs at large, jobs, people from working class backgrounds, like their parents were working in relatively unskilled jobs or in factory jobs, they constituted quite a large share of the workforce, whereas people whose parents were in backgrounds of being high managers and professional workers were a relatively smaller share. In the so-called arts jobs, these are creative industries jobs, not just the arts, the picture was extremely different. If your parents were managers, professionals themselves, you were much more likely to be able to get access to a job in the creative industries. And this report, I give the web address for it here, went on and showed a lot of other really interesting things, like asking people who they mix with. People in the creative industries are mixing with other people in the creative industries. They're tending not to mix with people that are in other sectors of the economy at all. So we're talking to ourselves, we're supporting ourselves, and we're employing people in our own sectors. So this is looking at young people who are going into work in the creative industries, and we have a much bigger flow coming in from the upper class backgrounds than from the working class backgrounds. And that's something which is mirrored in a lot of elite occupations and activities in our country, I'm afraid. And when we heard the question about, who can have influence, well, people that can have influence are often the people whose parents are people with influence as well. And that is a challenge that is now sort of widely recognized in many of the creative industries. We get newspaper stories again and again saying theatre is becoming a club for upper class actors. Most of our well-known younger actors these days are people drawn from the same narrow social circles as most of our well-known politicians are these days. Maybe our politicians are also more like entertainers themselves and actors than they are like the politicians we've had in the past. Well, why is this? Why is this exacerbating the pandemic? Richer people have more resources to let them get through periods of difficulty. They can afford to be unemployed. They can afford to have their freelance work drying up for periods of time because they have inherited wealth. They have families that can support them. They have better access to opportunities through social networks, through knowing the right people, for example. This includes, and this is one reason why there was so much outrage about the idea of restricting creative arts courses in universities. They can pay for training in higher education. They don't need particular grants and bursaries and support to get into these. They can afford the tools of the trade, like good computers, for example. They are good internet services. It costs quite a lot to have high quality broadband running in your house all the time. So they have access to these opportunities and resources. And this has become a pervasive criticism. There's a lot of criticism coming from people who are from more marginalized groups and people that are running quite a few organizations in the creative industries are aware this is a problem. And so there are efforts towards creating schemes to allow people who are excluded more access to things. So setting up scholarship so they can do creative arts training of one sort or another. This is one, and setting up schemes to encourage diversity within firms, within organizations, within the representation of one sort or another. This gets us into the field of the culture wars, because there's a lot of fight back going on. One of the big organizations for heritage in this country is called the National Trust. This looks after many, it's a membership organization. It looks after many important cultural and environmental features in this country. It is being criticized as being too woke because it has started preparing information on the historical background, the links to slavery, for example. Many of our fine country houses were built on the profits of the slave trade. And National Trust leadership has thought, well, maybe it's time we recognize this. Maybe one of the reasons that ethnic minorities feel excluded from many of these things is that they don't see recognition of the role that was played by, for example, Black labor in creating the wealth that's gone into many of these facilities. This is criticized as woke. This is political correctness gone mad. And last weekend, the National Trust had its annual meeting, and there was an effort to change its policies so that, for example, they wouldn't be asking their volunteers to support schemes to encourage ethnic diversity, or to recognize that maybe there are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual issues in many of their properties, because there are. We're running not just the crisis of the pandemic. There is a cultural crisis going on where we're seeing a fight back against some of the rather limited gains that have been made by minorities in recent years. So one feature of the pandemic is that at least digitalization means that access to some things has become more possible, because performances that were previously only live performances that you had to go to the theatre or opera house or concert hall to experience have been moved online. And many creative performers and professionals have welcomed these opportunities with open arms. So many people have created their own streaming experiences, their own video experiences that reflects and responds to the fact that they can't operate in the traditional way. So there's a great deal of innovation has gone on here. There's innovation in simply relaying things via streaming, but actually for things to work well via streaming, you typically need to repackage the program to get it to work in a more effective way through the new media. And this leads to a great deal of innovation as well. And we see all sorts of innovation going on in content as well, as work has engaged with the pandemic, with the issues of social isolation, of mental health, of communities coming together to support themselves during the pandemic and things like this. And so we're seeing quite an exciting wave of new public art emerging around the pandemic. So this partly answers Mikhail's question earlier on to do with innovation in the creative industries. There's innovative responses to the pandemic, not just surviving through it, but creating new messages through it. And I think that it's suggesting that creative industries, they can reflect and reproduce things in our societies. They can also challenge and open up spaces in our societies as well. An analysis of how creative industries are doing this in the recovery from the pandemic, such as it is something that's going to be really worthwhile as well. There are new opportunities here. We can learn from what different people are doing to create new sorts of good practice that may well inform and inspire us when the pandemic's gone, and help us be more resilient and confront future crises and challenges. Because it's pretty clear that there are going to be lots of crises and challenges in the future. The climate crisis is only one. The climate crisis is a pretty big one, and it brings many others in its wake. And it is something where creatives have actually had a great deal to say after a while. They're quiet at first, but have been very effective recently. And more power to them, basically, because there are going to be other pandemics in the future. That's almost certain. There are going to be other challenges like the climate crisis, but also challenges associated with ongoing social technological change. And you can take your pick from many crises, but the creative industries certainly have a great role to play here. I think there are many issues that arise. These are some of the takeaway issues that I would have here. That even the creative, I think for a long time, creative industries were dismissed as luxury activities that you can afford not to pay attention to when times are tough. I think we now see more clearly that they are activities which are absolutely vital when times are tough. So yes, people need bread, but they do not live by bread alone, to coin a very familiar phrase. Give us bread and give us roses, to quote someone else. So I think, again, there are some questions which I think might be questions which could be fruitfully discussed here. And some are questions about policy and the approaches we could be taking. But I mean, I think my ultimate question on this page is perhaps the most important one. Should we just be thinking of creative industries, or should we be thinking of creativity everywhere, or at least of creative industries as intrinsic to the whole systems that we're part of? So thank you. I hope I haven't been talking for too long this time. I lost track of what time I was meant to be finishing. So
thank you very much, Jan. It was truly fascinating talk, which uncovered basically a lot of specificities concerning creative industries in the pandemic, and also about some government actions regarding to creative industries. And you also uncovered some very deep issues, basically deep questions of concerning the UK cultural development. Yes, it is this crisis of culture. And also I would like basically to reflect on several issues regarding the presentation. So first of all, as we noticed, you talked about this quite a big amount of funding that the UK government delivered to the creative industries. And compared to Russia, for example, to my best knowledge, there was not any specific support of creative industries in particular. Rather, the government supported all the industries that suffered from the pandemic, and there was a particular list of this industry. Of course, it included some of them, but not very specific attention to the creative industries. Mostly the government actions during the pandemic included some tax incentives to small and medium-sized businesses and reduction of some administrative burden for most of the firms. But of course, now we know that the government has adopted the creative industries concept in Russia, and this is like a major document now. And of course, a number of also tax incentives is being discussed, in particular regarding creative industries. The idea is to make these activities more attractive to Russian businesses, similar to what has been made for the IT sector in the last years. Significant steps were made to make Russia attractive for IT businesses, so that they don't abandon the country, or rather stay here. What I also liked is that your slide regarding the graph is a graph about the creative industries workforce and social class division here, because we made the research which me and my colleagues presented at the latest conference on creative economy, which you also took part in. And so what is similar that we assessed the share of people with higher education in the creative industries, and it was around 70%. So 70% of the workforce in creative occupations had higher education, compared to around 45% for Russian workforce as a whole. So these are really mostly highly educated people working there. And of course, I was really surprised, positively surprised by this amount of sum which you mentioned, which was delivered to the creative industries. But what also surprised me was this article in the paper which you showed before, which stated that creative industries are expected to lose about 74 billion pounds. While you were talking, I shortly looked at the figures prepared, by the way, by the students. Last time we had a seminar with a task to find some statistics for creative industries. Yeah, so I looked into the UK presentation and found out that the UK creative industries GVA accounted for 116 billion pounds. So if this figure is correct, it's more than a half of all the creative industries GVA, which I found a bit surprising. But then I realized that this was probably good lobbying or marketing campaign, which finally resulted into this 1.5 billion pounds support. So this is my hypothesis.
Yes.
And finally, I think this was a good idea to make a comparison of freelancers in creative industries in Russia and the UK. I think we might find some statistics here as well. So it's for our future studies. And finally, what I liked most probably is the last question. Should we really be thinking of creativity everywhere rather than about creative industries as a particular sectors of the economy? And I think that from your previous section, it looks like creativity is kind of a national idea, maybe for the UK. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like the government, maybe it's historically like that the British people have much in common regarding this creativity idea, that everybody should be creative. And also I have had a short look at the latest UK strategy here, which is called Let's Create. And it says that like one of the goals is to develop creative abilities of each person, yes, and helping people realize creative potential. So finally, my question is I'm correct maybe it might be that creativity is a new or old national idea for the UK citizens and maybe broader for other people as well. Thanks.
Well, that's a great question. And certainly you can see ideas about creativity and the value of creativity running back, right back into the early, maybe even earlier, the early 19th century. You can find people like Charles Babbage talking about that as a really important capacity. How far these early people were thinking this was something which could be very widely experienced across the population, or as opposed to being something very elitist, I don't really know. But certainly we've been through waves where it's been seen as something which is a potential that is latent in just about everybody. Even Boris Johnson made a speech just in the past couple of weeks where he was essentially saying this is something, this talent is spread all over the country. Nobody would disagree with that. This speech rather surprised me, actually, because I would think there are actually quite a lot of people that do dispute that. See that parts of the country are poorer because people in those parts of the country don't have talent. That's my understanding. Otherwise, how could we tolerate the disparities we have in this country? But there's been our political dynamics are quite complicated. There is definitely an effort going on to appeal to parts of the country that have been neglected in the past, and people talk about rebalancing the economy, for example, and reaching places which have been neglected in the past. This is actually an immensely difficult thing to accomplish, and how it is going to be accomplished isn't clear. But fostering creativity very widely is in theory a policy goal. I think it's a policy goal which is contradicted by a lot of other policies in education, for example, where creative activities are tending to be pushed to one side because there is a great deal of argument that what we need to do is to be more like Singapore, or Asian economies, where there's a great deal of learning of certain basics in a very regular way, and there's been a great emphasis on tests, for example, and those tests are not tests of your creativity; they're tests of your having assimilated a particular approved body of knowledge. So we have a long history of battle between the teaching professions and governments about what should be being taught and how it should be being taught.
Yeah, I think that basically the issue of measuring creativity is relevant not only for macro level policies, but also for micro level, because psychologists, they still don't have a unique answer to this question, how to measure creativity. There is a huge number of various psychological tests, but because no one is excellent and perfect. Okay, so I would just ask maybe for some questions from the audience, or maybe some comments. Okay, maybe it's of course too late for Moscow, but I think maybe there's too much information to digest.
Right. Well, I think there is plenty to think about here, it would be one thing that I would react to your comment is having a higher education to get to a job. Obviously, this excludes people that haven't got higher education. But does it, maybe there are some jobs which demand that you have higher education by the nature of the job. Maybe some jobs don't, like some craft activities may not. So some creative industry activities probably don't, but some do. So working with film special effects probably does. But should your parents' educational level be determining whether you get jobs or not? That's another issue, because that is about class reproduction, basically. In a meritocratic framework, everyone should have the same opportunity to get higher education, and everybody with higher education, with the level of higher education, should have the same opportunity to get into those professional careers. Now, that philosophy is a very imperfect philosophy, But even if you accepted that philosophy, we don't live in that society. People do not have equal opportunities to go to higher education, partly because there will be things limiting them in their family background. So many houses don't have books, for example. So that's not very encouraging to children to learn to read autonomously. But also access to higher education is dependent upon your income and your experience of taking risks with money for your career. And that is something which is a lot easier for people from wealthy families than for people from poorer families. So having universities that can attract and retain students from less privileged backgrounds, that can recognize the talents and capabilities of those students and give them access to higher education is something that's rather important. We similarly see patterns of social exclusion that will exclude some immigrant groups, not all. You can play with stereotypes and see that some immigrant groups have a lot of their children going on to be doctors, dentists, lawyers, accountants, and so on. And some others, that's certainly not the case. There are many notable people that from those groups that do go on to substantial careers, but many are very restricted in their opportunities. So I can talk of many cases from my own experience of people who find their aspirations blocked and their capabilities not used adequately because of social structures, basically. Networks that support some people and not others. So I think this, the issues of social exclusion are ones that really need to be addressed when we're thinking of new policies for creative industries production and also creative industries consumption. I mentioned access to our cultural heritage in this country is quite limited. It's very evident that many people do not feel part of that cultural heritage and feel excluded from it. So ways of opening up and including them in it is really important. And that applies to historical heritage, but it will also apply to the elite arts, to classical music, for example, but even to painting, even to the art galleries. It's possible to develop strategies which make these places much more inclusive and much more attractive to people from various excluded groups. And that, whether that's class or gender or ethnicity, or sexuality, even, that's it's a ground where you get into political arguments, but where there's actually sources of creativity from diversity that can be of great value as well. And the benefits that come from absorbing a wide range of cultural influences are absolutely dramatic.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this really wise thoughts. Unfortunately, I think I have to close this brilliant masterclass now. But for me, it was truly interesting and fascinating following your talk and presentation. And we can only hope that really the government consequently will be solving all these problems, not only in the creative industries, but beyond them as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very
And
much.
Okay.
have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Yeah, good night.
Bye.
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 Bye.